and we'll be talking about soybeans. So the title of my presentation is pretty fancy: Home Field Advantage, Picking the Right Side to Play the Game. And I wish I could say I came up with this title, but I did not. I'm not that creative. I'll have to give the credits to Dr. Sybil for coming up with this great title. So we'll be talking about soybean fertility and choosing the right field and how that relates to soybean planting date. And just to give a little bit of context on what we'll be talking about today, why it matters and why it matters to you, we got to understand a little bit about soybeans in Illinois. So we know that only 35% of soybean in Illinois received phosphorus application. That's in 2020, but I don't expect that to change much between the years. Maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower. And that's true also for potassium. That's also true for nitrogen, since we don't fertilize soybeans for nitrogen. A lot of people say that soybean is considered a residual feeder. So a lot of farmers are in a 2-year biannual fertilizer program. They fertilize their corn and they rely on residual fertility for their soybeans. And I'll say that the only reason we can do that here in Illinois is because of the great soils we have in Illinois. 88% of the soils in Illinois are either molly soils or alfalfa soils. On average, 50-50, I would say. Half molly soil, half alfalfa soil. And even though some people will say that the molly soils in northern central Illinois are much more fertile than alfalfa soils are also very fertile soils. I can guarantee you that if we had the Brazilian soils, which is where I'm from, here in Illinois, everyone would fertilize their soybeans every year. So we have rich soils. However, we also know that soybeans have huge nutritional requirement. And I know Dr. Bill already showed you guys here. We'll have some slides that are very much the same, but I'm glad to say that these are important slides, so it will help you guys take the message home. So we know that we have huge nutritional requirement for soybeans. These numbers on pounds per bushel of nutrient, the production coefficients, are usually much higher than for corn. For nitrogen, for example, 4 times more than corn. For phosphorus, corn is 0.56. Soybean 0.71 per bushel. Potassium almost double as much on soybeans than on corn. So we have huge nutritional requirement. Why aren't we fertilizing our soybeans? Well, maybe our yield potentials are not as high as corn. So maybe we don't need to fertilize? Well, we don't know that for sure, and that's kind of what we wanted to learn with the research that we did here at the University of Illinois. Which nutrient correlates the best with soybean yield? With that, we would get the chance to know which fertilizer we should be investing our money on. And we gotta know which fertilizer to invest our money on because we know that fertilizers are quite expensive. I shouldn't be saying this because we sell a lot of fertilizer in Central Illinois on our retail group, but the truth is fertilizer is expensive. It's expensive for a grower, and we gotta use fertilizer wisely. We gotta use fertilizer that will improve your ROI, that will give you the best chance for the highest yield. And that's the objective of this study, to try and identify the soil chemical attributes that are most correlated to soybean yield in Illinois. With that, we would know maybe which fertilizer to invest on, because we can't forget about the law of the minimum. The law of Liebig, they say, actually was Carl Springer who came up with that law, and Liebig made it famous. But the most limiting nutrient is the most limiting nutrient for your yield. So you gotta fix those first, and if you go and apply those fertilizers, the chances of a positive ROI are the greatest. So I'm gonna explain a little bit how we did this research. We did not necessarily implement any fields to get this data. We utilized the huge, massive database that we have at the Crop Physiology Lab. So from 2014 to 2021, we got 1,340 soil samples collected from 35 different trials in 6 different locations in Illinois. All these different soil samples were collected using the same methodology. 10 subsamples from the trial area at pre-plant. That was 0 to 6 inches. All the soils were also analyzed by the same laboratory. So here I want to show consistency. We did everything the same way. They were all analyzed using the same methodology by the laboratory as well. This doesn't matter that much, but showing again consistency. And what we did with all these soil samples, we correlated them to yield of the unfertilized control plot. So every trial we have here, the crop physiology lab, we also always have a control plot where we don't apply any treatment. That means that these plots were relying 100% on what we have in our soils. And then we correlated those numbers to the yields of those replicated plots. Usually we have 6 replication, but some trials would have 8 and some would have 5 or 4, but most of them with 6 replication. And then we ran some statistical analysis. Today I'll be talking about some of the Pearson correlation, which on an easy way to understand is how much one variable changing is explaining the change of a second variable. I'll show some graphs here and you guys will understand a little bit better. So I want to start with my results here with this image that Dr. Bill is probably going to get pretty upset with me. There's a lot of information here and I don't want to go over all of this. What I want to tell you guys is when we ran those correlation analyses, we found that there was no strong correlation between soybean grain yield and nutrient concentrations on the grain. That's what this is showing. So red is negative, the darker red and the darker blue, it means positive and stronger, but that doesn't really matter. You gotta trust me, we did not see much of a correlation between nutrient concentration and soybean yield. We're like, well, doesn't it matter how much nutrient we have in the soil? That's what we initially thought. But we got some good data out of this, and Dr. Bill already showed some of the data that we got out of this trial, such as these correlations here. Correlations between grain yield and the yield components, for example. Dr. Bill just showed this graph here. We see that seed number is much more strongly correlated to yield than seed weight. One important thing about this is showing me that what we were doing on those trials, the management practices we were putting on those trials were affecting seed number. That doesn't mean that affecting seed weight is not possible. However, when do we start impacting directly seed weight on soybeans? After R5, after grain fill starts. Who's managing soybean past R5 or even past R3 here in Illinois? Very few growers. We were not in our trials. And because of yield component compensation, we were ending with more seed number by managing early season on, and it would compensate negatively and it wouldn't show any impact on seed weight. So I do see a lot of opportunity here. A lot of opportunity for later management on soybeans. And a lot of opportunity because we know that almost half of the biomass of soybean is accumulated after R5. Almost half of the nutritional requirement comes after R5. So there's a lot of room for opportunity. And talking to a lot of growers across America, I'm seeing that one way we'll be able to impact seed weight at later timings on your field is with the use of drones. I'm not necessarily promoting drones here, but I see the technology getting so much better over the last years, and that would be an easy way of getting in the field and actively managing your soybean. That's not necessarily the focus of the study here, just a sidetrack here real quick. Another thing that was very interesting about this study is that we were able to correlate the different planting dates with grain yield, and Dr. Bill already showed this. Showed that there's a very strong negative correlation between soybean planting date and grain yield. But I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in these correlations. I'm going to show you the correlations between planting date and the different yield components. And what we see is we have a slight positive correlation between seed weight and planting date, but a very strong negative correlation between seed number and planting date. And what is that telling me? It's telling me that the later I plant, the lower my seed number will be. And again, Dr. Bill touched on that, and that's because of the different yield components. The simplest way of looking at the soybean yield components is the multiplication between seeds per acre and the weight per seed. But we can go deeper in the seeds per acre and see that seeds per acre is actually correlated to the number of pods per acre, the number of seeds per pod, and the number of pods per acre is correlated to the number of nodes and pods per node. And what did Dr. Bill say we're losing when we plant later in the season? node number. We have less nodes. With less nodes, we have less points of attachment for those pods. With that, we end up with lower seed number. With that, we end up with lower yields. This varies year over year. Sometimes you plant early, your yield potential is high, but then your drought will happen at a critical timing, and that planting date might not have been the best for that year. But on average, we know that the earlier you plant, the higher is your yield potential. So this is some data coming from the research farm we have at Pleasant Plains, which is pretty close by to Springfield. And this is almost 10 years of soybean yield data over planting dates. This is standardized by percent of max. And we see around Springfield area the same thing we see here. The later you plant, the more you're losing your yield potential. That is true for both corn and soybean, but when we compare corn here, we see that corn super early is not always the greatest. Soybeans, they're a little bit more resilient. And because we were doing so many trials with soybean planting date at the time we were running this research here at the lab, I thought, well, maybe we should separate this data. We should separate it across different planting dates, and that's what I did. I used a little bit of the statistics, a little bit of magic here so I'm not biased on the planting date, so I subdivided the data in 4 quartiles. And today I'll be showing you guys the early planting date and the late planting date quartiles, which will represent soybean planted in April and also soybean planted in June. So very different planting dates. And now I'll do the same correlations again. Grain yield to planting date, but separating by, grain yield to nutrient concentration in the soil, but separating by the different planting dates that we have. First, let's look at the early planting soybeans. Again, here we have the correlations. If it's positive, means we're increasing one, it increases the other one. The bigger the number, the stronger the correlation is. For early planting dates, we did not see any strong correlations, maybe a little bit of organic matter. And organic matter has been repeating in all different correlations that I'm showing as a strong candidate for high yields. Why would that be? Well, organic matter is good for your soil. Good for your soil microbiome, it's good for your soil CC, retain more nutrients, and very good for your soil nitrogen availability. We know that nitrogen requirement for soybean is super high, so higher organic matter means higher nitrogen availability. Maybe that's why we see this slight, strong correlation with organic matter there. But here's where it gets interesting. When we look at the correlations between late planting date and these nutrient concentrations, we see that for all different nutrients, we have very strong correlations. Some are negative, but most of them are positive and very strong. What is that telling me? When I plant late, differences in soil nutrient concentrations are very much correlated to differences in soybean yield, meaning higher nutrient concentrations for these positive ones are correlated to higher yields. But that's when we plant late, not when we plant early. Why would that be? That's where the crop physiology part gets in. We try to understand what is happening. What is planting date affecting on the crop physiology that would show us this type of result? The first one is temperature. We know that the optimum temperature for soybean growth is about 86 degrees. Higher temperatures, higher growth. When we look at Central Illinois average temperature when we plant in April, 52 degrees. When we plant in June, 74 degrees. Here you have a graph of air temperature by plant growth rate. Growth rate means how much is that crop growing on a daily basis. Plant growth rate is strongly correlated to nutritional uptake rate. So the faster that crop is growing, the faster that crop is requiring nutrients from your soil. Meaning that when I plant late, that crop will have to take up nutrients faster from your soil. So we think there might be some correlation between how fast that plant is growing. When we look at a soil sample, for example, malic, we use some acid, is an acid extraction method, or even pea resin. In Brazil, it's pretty common, malic 1 with sulfuric acid and chlorhydric acid. That's how we analyze our soil. How do they do that? They'll get a small sample of soil. They'll put it through sieves, make it very fine, throw the extractants, agitate, try to extract that out very fast. And they got to do that so that the lab can actually work through a lot of samples on a day. So they will do that in 15 minutes and extract everything you have available in that soil. Well, the crop doesn't grow in 15 minutes. The crop grows much longer period of time, and the crop does not have those same acids that are very strong to release those nutrients from your soil. So there is a time issue here. The crop cannot get those nutrients fast enough sometimes, even though it has everything in your soil. And the faster your crop is growing, the more nutrients that crop will require on a daily basis. So that's one of the reasons we think that is happening. The second reason is, when we plant in April, we're planting under low incidence of sunlight. Our day length is much shorter. So again, this will have an impact on how fast that crop is growing. How fast that crop is growing will have an impact on how fast that crop is requiring nutrition from the soil, and that might be one explanation why we're seeing these differences. There's one new graph that I made just for this presentation, and it has to do with the cycle duration of soybeans. When we plant earlier, we're farther away from the summer solstice. So we tend to extend our vegetative growth, we tend to extend our total cycle. So here you have an example of phosphorus uptake in P2O5 per acre per day for 3 cycles duration, for a 125-day cycle, 150, and 175. And what do we see? The longer our cycle is, the shorter will be, or the lower will be our daily nutrient requirement. So maybe when we're planting early, we're not requiring as much on a daily basis as when we plant later, because that crop has to grow faster and get all those nutrients faster from the soil. So we see a decrease on the peak uptake of nutrients from the soil. So that's what I had to share with you guys today. Some key takeaways from my presentation. Soil test attributes are not well correlated with yield when soybean is planted early. That is likely because early planted will result in slower growth and slower rate of uptake of nutrients, meaning the soil can keep up with plant demand. Later planting dates have moderate to high correlation to soybean grain yield. That's likely because late planted crop has faster vegetative growth and higher rate of nutrient uptake. So that means, on a practical way, that if you plant your earlier fields where your soil test levels are lower and save your higher testing field for later planting, you'll probably get the highest total yield across your farm. Because if you're planting early, it doesn't really matter. We did not see that correlation. So planting on a high or low fertility level is likely to result in the same final yield. However, if you're planting late, it does matter the nutritional availability you have in your soil. And that's why it also correlates with some of the data that Dr. Bilo showed on response to fertility. We tend to see that soybeans, when planted late, are more responsive to added fertility, maybe because of all of this that I just shared with you guys here. So with that, I would like to thank all of you and thank the Crop Physiology Lab again for having me here today.